What makes a superpower decide that pressure is no longer enough? Sanctions can punish. Diplomacy can delay. Threats can intimidate. But war is different. War is what happens when a state decides that waiting has become more dangerous than striking first. That is the question hanging over the current conflict. Why did the United States really attack Iran? Before we continue, if you enjoy deep historical stories like this and want to better understand the forces that shape our world, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps support more videos like this. Now, let's return to the story. The question itself was simple. The answer was anything but. Was it because Iran posed an immediate threat? Was it about nuclear weapons? Was it about Israel? Or was it about something broader, the refusal of one of the few remaining regional states that still openly rejects American hegemony in the Middle East? Officially, Washington says the answer is straightforward. The White House framed the strikes as a preventive response to Iran's advancing nuclear program, ballistic missiles, and regional armed networks. In that explanation, the United States was not starting a war of conquest. It was acting before a larger danger matured. That argument was not invented from nothing. The International Atomic Energy Agency had repeatedly expressed concern over Iran's enrichment activity, including 60% enrichment at Fordow and a dramatically expanded stockpile. That still did not prove Iran had decided to build a bomb. But it did mean Iran had moved closer to a threshold that deeply alarmed Washington, Israel, and many regional actors. And yet that is not where a neutral analysis ends. It begins there. Because the real question is not whether Washington had any reasons to worry. The real question is whether those reasons fully explain why it chose war. And here history matters. The United States has used the language of urgent prevention before. In Iraq in 2003, the claim was that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction that posed an intolerable risk. But before the invasion, United Nations inspectors had not produced the kind of evidence that justified certainty. And after the invasion, the alleged stockpiles were never found. For millions around the world, that was not just a strategic mistake. It was a lesson. American wars can be sold as urgent necessities, even when the most dramatic justifications later collapse. Libya was different in legal form, but similar in how it shaped perceptions. The intervention of 2011 was justified through civilian protection, not Iraqi-style weapons of mass destruction claims. But it still reinforced a suspicion that limited Western military action in the Middle East often expands into something much larger than the original public case. That memory matters because when Washington now says we had no choice, many people no longer hear only security. They hear a familiar script. And that is why the timing of this war is so important. If Iran truly posed an immediate and unavoidable danger, then one might expect diplomacy to have completely failed. But only days before the strikes, both public reporting and statements from Iranian officials suggested that the talks had not collapsed. On February 25th, Abbas Araghchi said a deal was within reach if diplomacy were given priority. On February 26th, after indirect talks in Geneva, he described the discussions as among the most serious and longest, while mediation channels indicated further technical engagement was expected. After the attack, Araghchi said Trump had betrayed diplomacy. In later Iranian-linked accounts, he went further, saying the sides had come very close to an agreement and that solutions had been discussed before hawks gained the upper hand. Those are Iranian claims, not neutral proof. But they are important because they suggest another interpretation. That war may have been chosen not because diplomacy was impossible, but because some actors no longer wanted diplomacy to succeed. This is where Israel enters the story in a deeper way. A neutral reading cannot ignore that the United States has become significantly more aligned with Israeli security preferences, particularly under administrations willing to frame Iran not merely as a problem to be managed, but as the central strategic enemy in the region. Once Israeli-Iranian confrontation escalated into open war, Washington's room for distance narrowed. But beyond alliance loyalty, there was something more structural. American and Israeli threat perceptions were increasingly converging. In practice, that meant Israeli red lines were becoming harder to separate from American red lines. That still does not fully explain why Iran, specifically, is so intolerable to Washington. To understand that, we have to go further back. One of the deepest roots of this conflict lies in 1953, when Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown in a coup backed by the CIA and Britain after nationalizing Iranian oil. In American Cold War logic, that was strategy. In Iranian memory, it became something else, proof that when Iran tried to assert genuine independence, outside powers intervened. Then came 1979. The Iranian Revolution did more than overthrow the Shah. It removed one of Washington's key regional pillars and replaced it with a state that defined itself, in part, through resistance to American dominance. That matters enormously, because from that point on, Iran was not simply another difficult government. It was one of the few states in the region openly built around the rejection of a US-led order. Then came the Gulf question. In 1980, the Carter Doctrine effectively declared that control of the Persian Gulf was a vital US interest. Once that principle was set, any regional power capable of threatening Gulf stability, oil routes, or the broader American security architecture would inevitably be treated as a strategic problem of the highest order. Iran's geography, ideology, and regional reach made it exactly that kind of problem. From Washington's point of view, Iran became dangerous not only because of what it did, but because of what it represented. A state with missiles, regional partners, and growing nuclear leverage, sitting astride a region that the United States considers too important to fall outside its strategic design. From Tehran's point of view, the same facts look very different. Iran sees sanctions, military buildup, covert sabotage, Israeli coordination, and pressure on its allies not as isolated policy disputes, but as parts of a long campaign to weaken and ultimately domesticate the Islamic Republic. In that reading, the issue is not merely uranium enrichment. The issue is regime survival under siege. That does not make every Iranian claim true, but it helps explain why Tehran insists that the war is about more than nuclear policy. And this is the deeper, less advertised answer to why the US attacked. Yes, Washington publicly emphasized nuclear risks, missiles, and regional militias. But the larger strategic motive may have been this. Iran remained one of the few states in the Middle East still capable of meaningfully resisting American and Israeli regional preferences at the same time. It was not merely a threat because of what it might someday build. It was a threat because it refused to fit into the order Washington prefers. That does not mean the American case was entirely false. Iran's enrichment was real. Its missile power was real. Its regional network was real. But real risk and the real reason for war are not always identical. And there is another truth that must sit beside that one. Preventive wars are always built on prediction. They begin with the belief that future danger can be reduced by present force. They assume that striking now will make tomorrow safer. And history shows that this assumption can be sincere and still be catastrophically wrong. A fair reading suggests that the nuclear issue may have provided the most publicly defensible justification, while broader hegemonic and alliance considerations helped turn that justification into war. So was Iran really an imminent threat to the United States itself? The public record does not clearly prove that in the narrow sense Washington often implies. In fact, the existence of active negotiation shortly before the attack makes the language of immediate necessity harder to accept without skepticism. That does not prove the threat was fake, but it does make the claim of absolute urgency much weaker than the language of war usually suggests. And that is why this war feels so consequential. It is not just a conflict over missiles, centrifuges, or proxy forces. It is also a conflict over who gets to shape the Middle East. The United States says it acted because Iran had become too dangerous to deter. Iran says it was attacked because it would not submit. A neutral observer does not have to fully endorse either version, but neither should both be treated as equally weightless. Washington did have real reasons to fear Iran's trajectory. Yet history gives the world equally real reasons to doubt Washington's judgment when it claims that war is the last remaining option. So why did the US really attack Iran? Because Israel's influence on American policy had deepened. Because Iran's refusal to accept US regional dominance made it strategically intolerable. Because the nuclear file provided a usable public justification. And because in Washington, as in past interventions, the belief took hold that uncertainty could be managed by force before diplomacy had fully run its course. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel for more deep historical stories and geopolitical analysis like this.